Beneath the frozen vastness of the Ural Mountains lies a place both breathtaking and merciless, where beauty and danger are inseparably bound. Locals whisper that the winds there seem alive, carrying voices that echo through the valleys as if the mountain itself remembers every soul that dared to cross its path. Among these ridges lies a stretch of land known as Devil's Pass, a name earned not through myth alone, but through tragedy. In 1959, 9 young hikers, skilled and determined, ventured into this unforgiving wilderness. They carried with them strength, experience, and the quiet certainty that they would return. Yet what followed became one of the most chilling mysteries of the modern age. A vanished group, a torn open tent, bodies found under conditions that defied logic. And despite decades of theories, research, and speculation, one truth remains. To this day, no one truly knows what happened. The hikers, faces of determination, they were young, vibrant, and full of promise. 9 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, each carrying not only the weight of their backpacks, but the ambition of their generation. To them, the mountains were not merely obstacles of stone and ice, they were tests of endurance, stages upon which courage and skill could be proven. Each hiker had trained for this, earning the highest grades of experience in long-distance treks, skiing, and survival. Together they formed a team bound by camaraderie, trust, and a shared love for the wilderness. At the head of the group was Igor Dyatlov, just 23 years old but already known as a brilliant leader, meticulous in planning, and unshakable under pressure. Igor was the type who could read a map by starlight and inspire confidence even when storms raged. Friends described him as calm, thoughtful, and stubbornly determined, qualities that made him both respected and admired. Beside him walked Zinaida Kolmogorova, spirited and adventurous. She had a contagious energy, laughing easily, often cheering the group when fatigue set in. Her letters home spoke of excitement, never fear, as if she knew the hardships ahead would only deepen the memories they created. Then there was Rustam Slobodin, athletic, disciplined, a natural sportsman. His endurance was unmatched, his quiet focus balancing the louder personalities around him. Lyudmila Dubinina stood out in her resolve. Despite her young age of just 20, she was known for her toughness and outspoken nature. Friends said she had a fire in her spirit, unwilling to accept defeat no matter the odds. Alexander Kolevatov, thoughtful and serious, brought a scientific curiosity with him. He was fascinated by geology and often paused to examine the terrain, noting details others overlooked. There was Nikolai Thibault Brignol, whose easygoing humor often kept morale high, and Yuri Doroshenko, resilient and daring, a man who had once chased away a bear with nothing but a hammer in hand. Semyon Zolotaryov, older than the rest, was somewhat of an enigma, an instructor who joined at the last minute, experienced but mysterious, his reasons for coming never entirely clear. Finally, there was Yuri Yudin, the 10th hiker, who would eventually turn back due to illness, unknowingly escaping the fate awaiting his friends. Together, they were more than a team of hikers. They were a mosaic of personalities, leaders, dreamers, fighters, thinkers. They carried guitars to sing by firelight, journals to capture fleeting thoughts, and cameras to freeze moments of joy against the backdrop of snow and sky. Their journey was meant to be one of triumph, a winter expedition that would secure them the highest certification of mastery in their sport. But what none of them could foresee was how their names would be remembered, not as victors returning home, but as fragments of a mystery that would outlive them all. The laughter, the notes scribbled in diaries, the snapshots of smiles, they would soon transform into evidence, studied and dissected by generations searching for answers. And so, with spirits high and determination unshaken, they set out into the frozen wilderness. What awaited them was not glory, but silence. Setting out into the frozen wilderness. On January the 25th, 1959, the group departed by train, their spirits high, their laughter filling the cold compartments as snow rushed past the windows. Bundled in heavy coats, boots and woolen hats, they sang songs, joked, and jotted notes into journals that still survive today. For them, this was not simply a trek, it was an adventure, a mark of achievement. The journey to the mountains began, with warmth and anticipation, but with every passing mile, civilization slipped further away. The Ural Mountains rose before them like vast white sentinels, their peaks cutting into the sky. The locals had long regarded these ridges with both reverence and fear, calling the region Kholat Shachol, Mountain of the Dead. The hikers heard these stories, but to them it was folklore, the kind of tale told by villagers to keep strangers at bay. They smiled at the warnings, confident in their skills. Yet behind those smiles was the quiet truth. This would be their most difficult journey yet. The first days were manageable, the path familiar, marked with ski trails and footprints of travelers before them. The snow was crisp beneath their boots, crunching rhythmically in unison like a heartbeat echoing across the frozen landscape. They built campfires at night, their guitars filling the silence with melodies that danced in the bitter air. Journal entries described camaraderie, laughter, even small pranks pulled on one another. In those early days, the wilderness felt like a challenge they were destined to conquer. But as they pressed deeper into the mountains, conditions shifted. The wind grew sharper, biting through layers of fabric. Snowfall thickened, burying trails, forcing them to break their own path. Every step forward demanded strength and endurance. Fingers numbed, faces stung, yet they pressed on. Their supplies, carefully packed, became lifelines. Each loaf of bread, each bundle of dried meat carried the weight of survival. Psychologically, the mountains began to test them. Imagine marching in near silence for hours, surrounded by an endless expanse of white. No color, no movement, only the hiss of wind and the steady pull of exhaustion. The human mind begins to wander in such solitude, drifting between wonder and unease. Some of the hikers scribbled lighter notes in their diaries, making jokes about the cold or the food. Others wrote words that hinted at fatigue. Yet through it all, their determination never cracked. The group's leader, Igor Dyatlov, kept morale steady. He ensured the pace was fair, checked that no one lagged too far behind, and made decisions with unwavering confidence. His presence anchored the group, giving them faith that no matter how punishing the terrain became, they would endure. By January 31st, the wilderness began to show its merciless side. Snowstorms swept across the ridges, forcing the hikers to set up camp earlier than expected. Their maps revealed that they were approaching a treacherous pass, a barren slope exposed to brutal winds. Progress slowed. The mountains seemed to resist them, as though every gust, every drift, was meant to push them back. It was here, on the edge of that pass, that the hikers made their fateful decision. Instead of turning toward the safety of a nearby forested valley, they pressed forward into the open expanse of snow. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps determination, or perhaps simple miscalculation. Their tent was pitched on the slope of Kholat Shachol, exposed to the elements, but sturdy enough in their eyes to withstand the storm. That night, they wrote final words in their diaries, snapped photographs of each other, laughing through the cold and settled into their tent. From the outside, it seemed like just another night in the wilderness, but in hindsight, it was the last trace of normalcy before their trail disappeared into silence. The vanishing. When the trail went cold, when the hikers failed to return on their expected date in early February, there was no immediate alarm. In the world of winter expeditions, delays were common. Harsh weather, difficult terrain, even minor injuries could slow a group for days. Families reassured themselves with this logic, clinging to the certainty that the hikers were strong, prepared, and cautious. But as the days passed, that confidence eroded into unease. Letters remained unwritten, and silence pressed heavily on those waiting back home. At first, officials dismissed the concerns. The Soviet Union of the 1950s was not eager to launch a rescue at the whim of worried parents, but the hikers' reputations as experienced athletes carried weight, and their absence grew impossible to ignore. On February 20th, the search officially began. Volunteers, students, and soldiers formed groups that fanned out into the Ural Mountains, trudging through deep snow, guided by nothing but fading maps and the hope that they would find footprints. The rescue teams pressed deeper into the frozen wilderness, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of human life. What they eventually found was not relief, but the beginning of a nightmare. On February 26th, searchers stumbled upon the hiker's tent. At first glance, it appeared intact, half buried under snow, the canvas stiff with ice. But as they drew closer, details unsettled them. The tent was slashed open not from the outside but from within. Knife cuts tore through the fabric, as though someone inside had clawed desperately to escape. Even stranger, the hiker's belongings were neatly arranged inside. Boots, coats, blankets, food, even compasses and maps all abandoned. It was as though they had fled in the middle of the night without the very gear that would mean the difference between life and death. The searchers followed the only clue available: footprints. Bare human prints, some in socks, some completely barefoot, trailed away from the tent and down toward the nearby tree line. In the deep snow, the prints appeared strangely calm. No signs of chaos, no wild scattering, no overlapping rush of many feet. It was as if the hikers had walked deliberately into the storm in the dead of night, half-dressed and exposed. For nearly half a mile, the trail led searchers toward the forest, where the prints eventually vanished under drifts of snow. There, at the edge of the trees, silence awaited. The forest loomed like a wall, its branches heavy with ice, casting shadows that seemed to swallow the rescuers whole. Somewhere within those shadows, the truth was waiting. The scene at the tent defied every instinct of survival. Why would 9 experienced hikers abandon shelter in freezing temperatures without boots or jackets? What force could compel them to choose certain death over the safety of their camp? Questions swirled, unsettling those who searched. Some whispered about avalanches, others about panic, but nothing explained the orderliness of the footprints, the slashes from within the tent, or the careful abandonment of essential supplies. Day after day, searchers combed the forest, digging through snowdrifts, following faint traces that the storm had nearly erased. Each night they returned empty-handed, carrying with them the eerie memory of that hollowed tent, its silence louder than any scream. For weeks, families prayed for survivors. Perhaps the group had split. Perhaps they had built shelter elsewhere. But as February turned into March, hope withered. The mountain was merciless, and its silence grew heavier with each passing day. Then finally, searchers uncovered the first sign that the hiker's journey had ended in tragedy. At the base of a cedar tree beneath a thin layer of snow, they found the remains of a campfire. Nearby, two bodies lay sprawled barefoot, wearing nothing more than underwear and thin shirts. Their hands were raw, their skin bruised, as if they had clawed desperately at the bark of the tree above. Broken branches stretched high into the air, suggesting that one or both had climbed in a frantic attempt to spot the tent through the storm. The discovery chilled the rescuers to their cores. These young hikers, trained and skilled, had perished in ways that made no sense. The others were still missing, swallowed by the snow, and the mystery of why they fled the tent only deepened. And yet, the cedar tree would not be the final horror. It was only the beginning of a trail of grim discoveries, each more baffling than the last. The bodies in the snow. Unearthly discoveries. The cedar tree marked the first terrible revelation, but it was far from the last. After the discovery of the two half-naked hikers, searchers pushed deeper into the forest, their senses sharpened by dread. Every mound of snow became a question, every dark shape in the drifts a potential answer. Slowly, methodically, the mountain began to give up its secrets. A short distance from the cedar, searchers found three more bodies. They were sprawled as though they had been crawling, desperately trying to return to the safety of the tent. Their positions told a story of struggle, bodies angled toward their last point of refuge, arms outstretched as though reaching for salvation they could never touch. Unlike the first two, these hikers were better clothed, though still inadequately, for the brutal cold. Their faces were frozen in grim expressions and their fingers were curled tight, as if they had been fighting the snow itself. The cause of death was officially listed as hypothermia, but the conditions raised unsettling questions. Why would experienced hikers abandon warmth and supplies? Why did some wear only scraps of clothing, while others had scavenged pieces from the dead, hints of a desperate survival instinct in their final hours? The mountain had forced them into choices no human should ever face, but the true horrors were yet to be unearthed. For weeks, search teams continued to scour the pass. Snowdrifts concealed everything, and only when spring thaw began did the final four hikers reveal themselves. Their bodies were discovered in a ravine, partially buried beneath layers of ice and snow more than 2 months after the initial search began. What the rescuers saw there defied all expectations. Unlike the others, these hikers bore injuries that could not be explained by cold alone. One had a fractured skull so severe it resembled the aftermath of a violent car crash. Another had ribs shattered inward, the kind of trauma doctors later described as being caused by immense pressure, far beyond what a human could deliver. Even more unsettling, one of the women was missing her tongue. Another lacked her eyes. And though decomposition in freezing temperatures can take strange forms, these mutilations could not be easily dismissed. Adding to the mystery, traces of radiation were found on some of the clothing. The levels were not enough to kill outright, but they were far higher than one would expect on a typical hiking trip. Where did it come from? Some speculated secret military testing, others whispered of something not of this world. The ravine scene raised more questions than answers. How could 4 hikers, hidden together, sustain such catastrophic injuries while others nearby simply froze? Why were their wounds internal with little external damage, as though the force had crushed them from within? And who or what was responsible for the missing features? Even the arrangement of their bodies was strange. Some seemed to have died while attempting to care for the others, makeshift clothing torn from comrades, bandages fashioned from scraps of fabric. There was evidence of a fire built in the ravine, a last attempt to cling to life. And then, silence. The mountain, indifferent and vast, preserved their tragedy in snow and ice. Photographs taken by the searchers, still haunting today, show young faces frozen mid-expression, forever etched in time. To some, the images prove panic. To others, they suggest something more sinister, an encounter with forces beyond comprehension. By the time all 9 bodies were recovered, the story had transformed from tragedy into legend. What began as a missing persons case had become one of the most perplexing unsolved mysteries in modern history. The evidence did not align, the explanations contradicted one another, and the deeper investigators looked, the more impossible the truth seemed. The Dyatlov Pass had claimed its victims, but it refused to surrender a clear narrative, and so the world was left with fragments, a torn tent, scattered bodies, impossible injuries, and a silence that only deepened. The stage was now set for investigation, but the answers, when they came, were anything but satisfying. The investigation, answers that never came. When the last bodies were recovered, the Soviet authorities faced a puzzle that defied simple explanation. On the surface, the case might have seemed straightforward. 9 hikers, trapped in a brutal storm, succumbed to hypothermia. Yet the details resisted this tidy conclusion. The slashed tent, the barefoot trek, the broken bones without external wounds, the missing eyes and tongue, the strange radiation, none of it fit the script of a natural disaster. Still, an investigation had to be conducted. Soviet officials launched inquiries, interviewing rescuers, studying the bodies, and combing through the hikers' journals and photographs. At first, investigators leaned on practical explanations: exposure to the elements, exhaustion, panic brought on by an avalanche. But as they examined the physical evidence, contradictions surfaced. Avalanche victims are typically crushed beneath snow, yet the tent stood partially upright and undisturbed. Some hikers bore fatal injuries more consistent with car accidents or battlefield trauma than with mountain weather. And what about the radiation quietly noted in reports but never explained? Witness testimonies muddied the waters further. Locals claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky around the time of the incident, glowing orbs drifting silently above the mountains. The possibility of military involvement was whispered, though never confirmed. The Ural Mountains were no stranger to secret tests, and rumors spread of experimental weapons or parachute mines exploding above the hikers' camp. But these suggestions never found official support. The Soviet government was not about to admit to covert operation. Gone wrong. The investigation's conclusion, released months later, was as vague as it was unsettling. The deaths, it stated, were caused by a compelling natural force. Those words, carefully chosen, raised more questions than they answered. What kind of natural force could crush ribs without leaving bruises, strip a tongue from a body, or cause seasoned hikers to abandon their only shelter? If such a force existed, it was unlike anything documented in the annals of survival science. For the families, the report was devastating. They were left with grief, compounded by mystery, forced to accept official answers that offered no real comfort. Parents buried their children, not with the clarity of knowing what had happened, but with the haunting weight of what would forever remain unsaid. The files were quietly closed, sealed away from public scrutiny for years. The mountain was left behind, its silence unbroken, its snow covering the scars of what had transpired. But the Dyatlov Pass incident did not fade. Instead, it lingered in whispers, in secret conversations, in speculation that stretched far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. The investigation may have ended, but the story was only beginning. For every unsatisfying explanation offered, countless new theories arose, each more mysterious and more unsettling than the last. Theories that haunt with the official investigation. Closed and its conclusion unsatisfying, The Dyatlov Pass tragedy did not sink quietly into obscurity. Instead, it ignited a storm of speculation that has persisted for decades. Each theory offered a thread, a possible explanation, but none could weave the fragments into a seamless whole. To this day, every answer feels incomplete. Every possibility raises as many questions as it silences. The most common theory, and the one many officials quietly favored, was the avalanche explanation. According to this idea, the hikers camped on a slope prone to snowslides. In the dead of night, shifting snow or a minor avalanche might have struck their tent, forcing them to slash their way out in panic and flee into the open. It explains their barefoot escape and their rush away from the tent. But there are problems. When rescuers found the campsite, the slope showed no signs of a large avalanche. The tent was still standing, partially buried, but not destroyed. And those catastrophic injuries, fractured ribs and skulls, did not match the force of a small avalanche. If snow had been the killer, why didn't it leave clearer evidence? Others proposed that the hikers stumbled into the midst of Soviet military testing. The Ural Mountains were remote, secretive, and often used for experiments shielded from public eyes. Some suggest that the hikers may have encountered parachute mines or experimental bombs dropped from planes. The strange lights reported in the sky by witnesses in nearby villages could fit this theory. Explosions could create internal injuries without external trauma, much like the kind discovered on the bodies. Radiation on their clothing might even point to this possibility. Yet, no military records ever confirmed testing in that area at that time, and if it were true, why allow such a story to ever leak out? Cover-ups leave traces, but here the silence was almost too clean. Another explanation drifts further into the unknown: UFOs and extraterrestrial encounters. Eyewitnesses spoke of glowing orbs hovering above the mountains the very night the hikers perished. Some enthusiasts argue that an otherworldly force could have caused the hikers' bizarre injuries, the radiation, and their frantic flight into the snow. The missing tongue and eyes, they claim, might be evidence of experiments beyond human comprehension. Of course, skeptics dismiss this theory as fantasy, pointing out that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. Still, the unsettling nature of the deaths leaves room for the imagination to wander, and once the mind opens to cosmic possibilities, the silence of the mountains feels even more ominous. Some turn instead to the paranormal. The pass's local name, Mountain of the Dead, wasn't given lightly. Indigenous Mansi legends spoke of cursed lands, places where spirits prowled, and those who trespassed were doomed. Could the hikers have encountered something ancient and unseen, a force of folklore made flesh? Such a theory can never be proven, but the strangeness of the events, the calm footprints, the mutilations, the sheer terror suggested by fleeing into sub-zero night fits the framework of an encounter with something not bound by the laws of nature. Even within the realm of psychology, theories abound. One suggests paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where hypothermia victims feel an intense burning sensation, causing them to remove clothing despite freezing conditions. This could explain why some were barely dressed or why others wore mismatched garments scavenged from their companions. Yet paradoxical undressing does not explain the catastrophic internal injuries, nor the radiation, nor the disciplined trail of footprints leading calmly away from the tent. Still others argue for a darker, more human possibility: conflict within the group. Could a fight have broken out, leading to panic, injury, and flight? Diaries and photographs show camaraderie and laughter, not tension, but isolation, exhaustion, and fear can twist even the strongest bonds. Yet there is little to suggest violence among them, and no defensive wounds on the bodies. Each theory presents a fragment of clarity, only to collapse under the weight of contradictions. Avalanche explains the flight, but not the injuries. Military testing explains the radiation, but not the footprints. UFOs explain the strangeness, but lack evidence. Paranormal theories explain the atmosphere, but cannot be proven. In the end, every possibility seems to dissolve into the same chilling truth. The mountain holds its secrets, and perhaps that is why this mystery endures. Because no theory fully satisfies, the Dyatlov Pass incident lingers in the imagination as an unsolved riddle. It is a mirror reflecting human fear, fear of the unknown, fear of forces beyond control, fear of stepping into a wilderness that does not forgive mistakes. But beyond theories and speculation lies another dimension of this tragedy. Not just what happened, but why we cannot let it go. Why does this story haunt us still? For that, we must step into the human mind itself. Survivors who never existed. The human psychology. What makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so haunting is not only the mystery itself, but the way it plays upon the human mind. 9 young people ventured into the mountains, yet not one returned. In most survival stories, there is at least a witness, someone who escaped, someone to tell the tale. But here, there were no survivors. No final testimony, no voice to explain what happened in those frozen hours of terror. The silence left behind is what grips us most. Human beings are wired to seek closure. We crave explanations, neat endings, stories where cause and effect align. When tragedy strikes, we search for meaning because meaning provides comfort. But the Dyatlov case refuses that comfort. Every diary entry, every photograph, every footprint in the snow is a fragment without a whole. The hiker's final moments live on in broken details that resist resolution. And so our minds keep circling the question, what really happened? Psychologists argue that mysteries like this tap into a primal fear, the fear of the unknown. The hikers were skilled, experienced, and prepared, yet they were undone by something they could not control, perhaps could not even comprehend. We see ourselves in their story, imagining what we would have done in their place. Would we have
stayed in the tent? Would we have fled? Could we have survived?
The Dyatlov Pass does not just tell us what happened to 9 strangers, it forces us to confront our own fragility. There is also the strange intimacy of their preserved legacy. Their cameras captured them laughing in the snow, their journals recording light-hearted jokes, songs, even hopes for the future. These fragments make them feel close, familiar, as though we know them. And then, abruptly, they vanish. It is this contrast, the warmth of their humanity against the cold brutality of their deaths, that makes the story unforgettable. Perhaps this is why the case endures after decades. It is not only a mystery of evidence, but a mirror reflecting our deepest anxieties, the fear of dying without answers, the fear of being swallowed by a world indifferent to our existence. In the silence of Devil's Pass, we see not only what happened to them, but what could happen to us. The legacy of Devil's Pass in the decades since that frozen night in 1959, the Dyatlov Pass incident has transcended tragedy and entered the realm of legend. What began as a regional mystery in the Soviet Union slowly spread across the world, capturing the imagination of historians, scientists, storytellers, and conspiracy theorists alike. Today, it is more than a case, it is a cultural touchstone, a reminder of how fragile human certainty can be when confronted by the unknown. For the families of the hikers, the legacy is deeply personal. Monuments were erected near the site, their names etched in stone against the backdrop of the mountains that claimed them. Each year, visitors still come to pay respects, laying flowers in the snow. For some, it is a pilgrimage, an attempt to feel closer to the young men and women who never came home. The mountain is no longer just a landscape. It is a memorial, a scar carved into memory. As decades passed, the case drew broader attention. Journalists reopened the story. Filmmakers produced documentaries, and authors pored over the files, each trying to stitch together the fragments into a coherent narrative. Expeditions returned to the site, hoping that new technology might solve what old reports could not. Some claimed progress, others only deepened the mystery. Theories multiplied, echoing across books, podcasts, and faceless YouTube channels, where
millions still listen in fascination, waiting for the moment when the truth might finally be revealed. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the legacy is the way the place itself feels transformed.
hikers who brave the route today describe an oppressive atmosphere, a silence that presses down with unnatural weight. The wind seems sharper, the nights darker. Some claim they feel watched, as though the mountain carries memory, unwilling to release the echoes of the past. The very name, Dyatlov Pass, has become synonymous with eerie tragedy, a phrase that chills even those who have never set foot in Russia. The incident has also sparked something deeper in modern culture, a reflection of our endless fascination with unsolved mysteries. It reminds us that even in an age of satellites and science, there are places where answers remain out of reach. The Dyatlov Pass endures not because we know what happened, but precisely because we do not. It is the tension between fact and possibility, silence and speculation, that keeps it alive. And so, the legacy of Devil's Pass is not only about 9 hikers who never returned. It is about the story that outlived them, the questions that refuse to die, and the way a mountain became a symbol of mystery itself. Outro: the unanswered silence. In the end, the story of the Dyatlov Pass remains suspended in a space between fact and fear. Decades of investigation, speculation, and debate have not brought us closer to a single, undeniable truth. What happened on that frozen slope in February of 1959 continues to resist resolution, as though the mountain itself has locked its secret
away, and perhaps that is why the story endures, not because of what we know, but because of what we never will. The silence of the Ural Mountains is its own kind of answer. Imagine standing there today, the snow crunching under your boots, the wind howling across the ridges.
You look out into a wilderness unchanged by time, and you realize that the hikers stood in this same place, hearing these same sounds moments before their fate was sealed. It is this closeness, the nearness of their final breath, that unsettles us most. For some, the lack of closure is unbearable. We want answers, neat conclusions, stories that end where they should. But the Dyatlov Pass incident offers none of that. It confronts us with ambiguity, with the possibility that human understanding has limits. And in that void, the imagination thrives. We fill the silence with theories, snow slabs, secret weapons, UFOs, spirits, because anything feels more comforting than admitting we may never know. Yet there is a strange peace in leaving the story open. Mysteries like this remind us that the world is not fully mapped, not fully explained. There are still corners of the earth and of human experience that defy logic. And perhaps it is that defiance, that resistance to explanation, which keeps us returning to this tale. Each time we revisit it, we project ourselves into the snow, into the silence, into the unanswered. As we close this journey, one truth remains. 9 lives were lost in the cold embrace of the Ural Mountains. They were young, determined, and full of promise, yet they became part of a legend larger than themselves. Their story lingers because it touches something primal within us, the fear of the unknown, and the haunting possibility that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. And so, the mountain keeps its silence, and we, still searching, keep listening,